So when we got in touch and asked you to participate in our project and asked you if you would do the Screen Epiphany, considering the idea of it is the film that kind of inspired you or left some mark, was Se7en always the first one on your list? Did you have a few that sort of came to mind?
There were a lot that came to mind in terms of what I was impressed by and what I had enjoyed. But if I really narrowed it down, the rubric was what had inspired me or what was significant in some way to me as a writer. And I think Se7en was the one, simply for my reaction while I was watching it. I mean, it is a great, great movie from a writer's point of view, because it sounds simplistic and obvious, but writers have got to write a story. And stories can be difficult to write. They need to be somehow cogent. They're better if they're organic in some way. And they're not that easy to find. And this one, I mean, I don't think most people have seen it, so it's not really giving anything away to say that it's a very noir police procedural based on the 7 deadly sins. And you would think that that is an easy idea to come up with, but it's really not. Something that basic, simple, and organic, strangely, is very difficult to come up with. So it came out around the time that I was first starting to write my first book, and so I was in true writer mode at that point, and I watched the movie, and I remember just thinking, damn, I wish I'd thought of this. Because it was a clean idea, it was so clean, so self-contained, it drove itself, essentially.
Do you mean like kind of structurally it had that?
Exactly, it was a ready-built structure. Here it is, just tell the story. It was fabulous. I was so jealous of it. I just thought, God, I wish I had come up with that. Which actually is the biggest compliment any writer can give, just to say, damn, I wish I'd thought of that. And then, so I'm watching the movie, and I am, it becomes fairly evident what it is. There's going to be 7 chapters, essentially. And then at some point you start thinking, well, if it's just 7 linear chapters, that structure becomes weak towards the end. And so you think, what would I do about that? And then all of a sudden, I remember just a moment, all of a sudden thinking, yeah, this is what I would do. Because you can count.
Whilst you were watching, sort of
Yeah, exactly. While I was watching, and we can count, and so we're counting enough. There's 7 things. You get to sort of 4. You're about to hit 5, and you think, God, I know how I would do this, and it flashes into your head. I know exactly what I would do, and it would be the best ending ever. But they won't do it. Surely they won't do it, and they do it. They do it right, and I think. I can't exactly, I will. I'll repeat what I felt sitting in the audience. I thought, fuck, they did it. And I was so, I was so impressed by it, but I just felt somehow happy to be in the storytelling community. I thought, God, we're good. Storytellers are so good. And because it was just the neatest, most perfect, the most intricate, the most obvious ending. It was exactly the thing to do. They did it in exactly the way it should be done, in a way that I thought they would chicken out.
Yeah.
But they didn't. It was terrific.
And it's quite a rare thing, isn't it, to have a mass market, big American movie production that ends in such a desolate way. I mean, they're always behind. They never catch up, and in the end they lose, and it's grim.
Yeah, it is grim, and the fundamental test that is set at the end, he fails. He does what the bad guy wants him to do, what he shouldn't have done, and so it's a defeat. But you say it's rare. This was 20 plus years ago now, and. I think sadly that's the history of movies, that they're becoming less adventurous, much more timid. If you can go back, I remember when I was in high school and dating, there was nothing else to do apart from go to the movies, and what little bits of movies you saw from the back row. There were some pretty impressive, brave movies. Just randomly, I remember seeing MASH, and that's got a lot of anti-religious stuff in it and very angry stuff that wouldn't get made now. And then there were movies later like The Deer Hunter.
Yep.
I mean, how long is that wedding scene at the beginning of The Deer Hunter? I don't know specifically.
They literally don't make them like that anymore.
No, I mean, that would have to be done in 35 seconds now. The Godfather, same thing. How long is that wedding? They just don't. The time, the patience has gone. So a lot of things have changed. And so sadly, as good as this movie is, I very much doubt whether it would be made today.
And when I was when I rewatched the film, knowing that we were going to have this conversation, it was impossible for me not to watch it thinking of the Reacher novels and thinking about your work. And what struck me, it's interesting because obviously I went online and did some research about you as well. And something that came through was that a lot of writers who cover your work talk about the Reacher series as a kind of guilty pleasure. And personally, I've read 9 or 10 of them, and I feel as though they operate on a kind of series of different levels. And that's what Se7en does as well. I mean, it can be a really heads-up, straightforward, thrilling, gripping, kind of tense thriller, but there's enough in there. There's loads of cinematic references, there's lots of literary references. You can go as deep as you want. And to me, there's a sort of resonance there with how you approach. Is that a fair observation, do you think?
Yeah, I really think it is. I think that, from my point of view as a book writer, I want a big audience. And the way to get a big audience is audiences are not homogenous. The way I visualize it is the book audience is like the rings of Saturn. In the center are the really true expert habitual readers who read, maybe 5 or 6 books a week. And then if you want to make a good living, you've got to go all the way out to the edge of the rings of Saturn, where you get the guy who reads 1 book a year on his summer holiday. And even then, as a kind of, it's almost a distressed purchase. You can see them in the airport. They've got to check in.
Is this something you do? You actually...
Oh, yeah, absolutely I do. I've always done that. In my previous job in television, you've got to observe how people consume things and why they consume things. And in the airport, you've got to check in early, and then you're stumping around the airport, and you see these, particularly men, and they're almost saying, damn it, I better buy a book. And so they choose a book, and that's maybe the only book they'll read that year, and I've got to satisfy them too. And the only way really of doing that is to have these imperceptible levels where the expert reader is satisfied, the casual reader is not patronized. And so you've got to separate the levels. And like a dual level DVD, the laser finds whatever level it's supposed to be on and is happy with it. So, I think that's the way to make great commercial art, is that you make it accessible to anybody who wants to approach it.
Sure. And also watching it, the other thing I found impossible to ignore in the context of you choosing this film was that in all of the Reacher novels, his kind of agency in the story and the thing that drives him is kind of vengeance. It's not always vengeance. It's the thing that he's vengeful of shifts from story to story, but there's always a vengeful thing. And this film is basically about that. There's a kind of vengeance being carried out upon society, a kind of broken and corrupt society. So that was really striking to me. And you mentioned before that this came out just before you sat down and wrote the thing. And I've always kind of wondered how much of you is there in Reacher, because you were doing kind of a vengeful thing when you wrote the first book, weren't you?
Yeah, I mean, I hoped that Reacher is the good side of vengeance rather than John Doe's side. But yeah, I had a great job. I worked for Granada Television in Manchester. I was having a great time. And then I was fired because ITV changed in the middle 90s, like a lot of industries. The old expensive veterans, which I was at the age of 39 at that point, they were all gotten rid of. And so I was mad as hell. Not particularly about myself, because I figured I'll find something to do. But I was just mad that, as you know, ITV, especially Granada, I think, by that point was a real cultural institution. And it was just being trashed by barbarians. And some really nice people had put in 2 generations of work building it up to what it was, and it was being trashed. And I was pretty furious. So a lot of that anger goes into those early books. And in fact, for the first, I don't know, 8 or 10 books, the bad guys are all named after the board of directors. And some of them have pretty exact physical descriptions. There was one executive, a woman who really annoyed me, and she's described to the T. You know, the thinning hair, the crooked teeth, everything was in one of the books. And I figured I'd get away with it. We have this theory called the small dick defense, which is that nobody's going to sue you, because nobody's going to stand up in court and say, you know, that lying, backstabbing weasel in that book, that's me.
So to answer my question, there's quite a lot of you in Reacher.
Yeah, really.
So let's stay with Reacher for the moment. This is the latest one. I believe it's new in shops. We've got a bunch of copies of these which have been signed by Lee, which are, again, available in our film store. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this? Like, where's Reacher going this time? What's the...
Well, in this one, Reacher, you know, the problem with Reacher is, for those that don't know him, he doesn't have a job, he doesn't have a home. He's an ex-military unemployed drifter, like the knight errant. You know, really a classic mythic figure, but vaguely realistic in the modern world. And so it's very hard to get him involved in anything. He's not like the cops in the movie who literally a cop sits there and the trouble comes to him. Reacher has to discover the trouble somehow, and that's usually quite difficult to do, short of an outrageous coincidence. But I figured in this one it's a pretty neat start in as much as he is being aimless. His own aimlessness gets him into the problem, which is that he's just taking an aimless stroll past a pawn shop, P-A-W-N shop. And he sees all the sad stuff in the window, you know, the old, dusty old guitars that are never played and the cheap jewelry that has been hocked. And in America, whatever you do, graduate high school, graduate college, whatever, you get a ring called a class ring. And so there's the tray of pawned class rings from obscure Midwest high schools. But one of them isn't. It's West Point 2005. Which is the U.S. Military Academy, which is a serious college plus a very tough military academy. And it's a tiny ring, so it was a woman cadet. And Reacher's a West Pointer too, and he figures nobody would give that up. After going through 4 hard years, why would she give it up? And so he figures there's trouble behind it, and he determines to find out where the woman is and return the ring. And maybe if she has a problem, he'll help solve it. And it's not so much that Reacher cares about her. I mean, he does, but Reacher's focus is never about helping the little guy. There's a passage in one of the earlier books where somebody says, why were you an MP, a military policeman? And he gives a vague answer like, I want to help the little guy. And the questioner is skeptical. She says, really? You care about the little guy? And he says, no, not really. I just hate the big guy. And that's the vengeance that Reacher has, that he will not stand by and let some big, powerful, faceless thing or person exploit or hurt other people. Not so much because he cares for the people, but he just hates that process of the big guy hurting them. And in this one, it's a little bit, a lot of the books, there is an identifiable person where he can be taken down, but this one is a larger problem. I mean, I don't think it's giving too much away to say that the opiate crisis in America, it features in this book, which is a huge problem. And read the book; it's got the history of opiates in it.
So this one is back in the present day.
It is present day.
Night School. The previous one was
Night School was a prequel.
A bit, didn't it? Yeah. Fantastic. So, how are we doing for time? Are we a few minutes? The other thing where I was feeling a kind of resonance between your work and the film was this kind of a kind of sense of meticulous attention to detail, which is David Fincher's approach in this film. You'll all see it. That there's a really meticulous. You can feel it coming off the screen, the way that they've studied the procedural aspect and how they would do things. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of how you research that side of things in your work?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what this movie does is it is extremely meticulous, right from the opening credits. I mean, the opening credits are amazing in terms of their composition, absolutely meticulous. Because what the movie has to do, any story requires conflict. I mean, that's the basic paradigm of any story, conflict between good and bad. And, of course, the greatest conflict paradigm of all time is David versus Goliath. And so if you step back from the detail of the movie and look at it fundamentally, I think the two policemen, Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt, represent one character. You know, they're the forces of good, a combination of age and experience and youth and vigor representing one side, and the psychopath is the bad. So it's mythic, it's legendary, but you can't really just do stories as mythic, legendary stories. You have to invest them in the modern world where the detail comes in, and that's what I do with Reacher. Reacher is fundamentally a mythic and legendary character that dates back through all the eras. That there's always been that knight errant, the mysterious stranger, the noble loner. In the Westerns, in medieval European folk tales, Scandinavian sagas, you could say religious myths, the savior showing up. Before that, you get the ancient Greeks. There's always this character, but you can't afford just to have a straightforward myth. You've got to dress it up and invest it as modern. And so, just like in the movie, the Reacher books are full of actual things happening and realistic detail. And detail is great. I love detail. It's really, if you get a good telling detail in half a line, it's worth more than a couple of pages, you know.